Chains rattled against the rotting wooden floor, a desperate cry echoing through the empty house. In the darkness, a pair of amber eyes glowed, pleading, waiting. But when rescuers arrived, something was terribly wrong. The abandoned house stood on the edge of town, a skeletal remnant of a forgotten past. Its windows were broken, jagged shards reflecting the dim glow of a dying sun. The roof sagged under the weight of neglect, and the walls, once painted in warm tones, were now faded and peeling. But it wasn't the house itself that drew the rescuers. It was the sound. A low, guttural whimper, barely audible beneath the whistling wind, but unmistakably filled with pain. Inside, the air was thick with dust, cobwebs stretched across the corners like forgotten memories. And in the center of the living room, where a grand fireplace once roared with warmth, lay the source of the sound. A German shepherd. His fur, once undoubtedly a proud shade of black and tan, was now matted with dirt and dried blood. His ribs jutted out from beneath his coarse coat, and his legs trembled as he struggled to remain standing. But it was the chain that told the true story. Rusted and thick, it was looped tightly around his neck, its length barely allowing him to move more than a foot in any direction. The floor beneath him was scratched raw, a testament to how many times he had fought to free himself. And yet, despite the agony etched in his every movement, his eyes held something that stunned the rescuers into silence. Loyalty. He didn't bare his teeth or growl in fear. He didn't retreat, despite every reason to distrust humans. Instead, he watched them, ears twitching slightly as if listening for something, someone. His head lifted just enough to show a faded leather collar beneath the chain, a name barely visible through the grime. "Max," whispered Emily, the lead rescuer, as she crouched down, her heart aching at the sight of him. Max didn't flinch. He only stared, his amber eyes scanning her face, searching for something that Emily couldn't quite understand. It was as if he was waiting for an answer, for confirmation that she was here to do more than just free him. That she was here to listen. "Who would do this to you?" she murmured, reaching out slowly. Max's ears flicked back, his body tensing just slightly, but he didn't pull away. He let her fingers brush against the cold metal chain, let her feel the weight he had carried for God knows how long. And when she gently ran her hand down his muzzle, he exhaled, a deep, shuddering breath that sounded more like relief than fear. Behind her, Mark, another rescuer, examined the room. There was no sign of food or water, nothing to suggest that Max had been cared for in weeks. Just empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and the faint, acrid stench of abandonment. "Someone left him here to die," Mark muttered, clenching his fists. But Emily wasn't convinced. If Max had been abandoned, why wasn't he trying to escape? Why wasn't he snarling in anger or pacing in desperation? Instead, he was still, watchful, waiting. She turned back to him, studying his expression. That's when she noticed it. The way his eyes kept flicking past her, toward the doorway leading deeper into the house. A chill ran down her spine. She had assumed Max was waiting for a rescuer. But what if he was waiting for someone else? "Mark," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think he's alone." Mark turned sharply, his brow furrowing. The wind outside howled through the broken windows, rattling the old wooden beams. The house was empty, or at least, it should have been. Emily slowly stood, her boots creaking against the rotting floorboards. Max didn't move, but his gaze followed her every step. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't desperate. He was protecting something, or someone. "Check upstairs," Emily instructed, glancing at Mark. "I'll take the basement." Max let out a low whine as she turned away, a sound so mournful it sent a fresh wave of unease washing over her. Emily hesitated, and then she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper from the shadows. A rustling. A breath. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone. Emily tightened her grip on her flashlight, her pulse hammering in her ears. The sound had come from beyond the darkened hallway, where the air was thick with dust and something more. Something unseen, yet undeniably present. Max let out another whimper, his body shifting slightly, as if torn between his trust in Emily and the instincts that had kept him alive all this time. She turned back to him, kneeling once more. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Max's ears flicked forward, and for the first time, he moved, not toward her, but toward the darkness, his chained body straining as if trying to get closer to whatever lay beyond. A warning. A plea. Mark noticed it too. "Emily, I don't like this. Something's off." But Emily had already made up her mind. She followed Max's gaze, stepping past the shattered remains of a coffee table, her boots crunching against scattered glass. The house creaked under the weight of her movement, as if waking from a long and troubled sleep. Each step took her further away from the relative safety of the front door, further into the unknown. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors that gaped open like hollow mouths. Faint beams of moonlight filtered through the shattered windows, casting long shadows that danced across the warped floorboards. The stench of mildew and decay clung to the air, but beneath it was something else, a scent she couldn't quite place. Then, a faint noise. A shuffle. Emily froze. Mark was still near the entrance, his silhouette barely visible against the dying light outside. If she called for him, it would break the silence, shatter whatever fragile moment was lingering between her and the unknown. Instead, she pressed forward. Max's chain rattled behind her, his low whimper growing softer but not stopping. He was watching her, willing her to understand. And then she saw it. The basement door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness cutting through the faint glow of the hallway. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing the wood. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if whatever was on the other side had never known warmth. She took a breath, then another, and pushed. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into complete blackness. The scent hit her instantly, coppery, heavy, the unmistakable tang of something long left to rot. Her stomach tightened, a whisper of movement. Emily's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the basement walls. Stone, cracked with age, lined with old wooden shelves and dust-coated tools. In the farthest corner, a pile of discarded blankets lay in a heap, something shifting beneath them. She stepped forward. "Hello?" Her voice came, quiet but firm. No response. Another step. The blankets rustled. And then, a gasp. Not from Emily, from something else. She barely had time to react before the blankets shifted violently, and a pair of wide, terrified eyes peered out from beneath them. A child. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A girl, no older than 6, her face smudged with dirt, her hair tangled and unkempt. Her eyes were wide, hollow with hunger and fear. She shrank back against the stone wall as if willing herself to disappear. Emily's mind raced. How long had she been here? Who had left her? And why was Max, a starving, abandoned German shepherd, chained upstairs as if standing guard? Suddenly, everything made sense. Max wasn't just waiting. He was protecting her. The girl flinched as Emily lowered to one knee, keeping her voice as soft as she could. "Hey, sweetheart. It's okay. I'm here to help." The child didn't move, didn't blink. Her fingers clutched the tattered blanket like a lifeline. Then, slowly, cautiously, her gaze flickered past Emily, to the stairway behind her. Emily's stomach turned cold. The girl wasn't looking at her. She was looking at something else. Someone else. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs, and then a creak, a footstep. Emily's blood ran ice cold. Someone else was in the house. Emily's breath hitched as the floorboard above groaned under the weight of something, or someone, moving. Her flashlight flickered, its dim glow casting jagged shadows against the basement walls. The child trembled, her tiny hands clutching the tattered blanket, her hollow eyes filled with something Emily recognized instantly: terror. The realization slammed into her like a freight train. This girl wasn't just hiding. She was hiding from someone, and they were still here. The silence in the house turned suffocating, pressing down on Emily's chest like a vice. The rescuer in her wanted to reassure the child, to whisper promises of safety, but the survivor in her knew better. Any sound could give them away. Above, another footstep. Slow, deliberate. Emily's instincts screamed at her to move, to act, but her limbs felt frozen. She could hear Mark shifting near the entrance, oblivious to the growing danger. He hadn't heard it, but Max had. A low growl rumbled from above. It wasn't menacing, nor was it aggressive. It was a warning. Emily moved fast. She pressed a finger to her lips, signaling the child to stay quiet, and then reached for her radio. But before she could speak, another sound sent ice through her veins. The chain rattled. Max was still bound upstairs, but he was no longer waiting in silence. He was pulling, straining. His growl grew deeper, turning into something raw, desperate. He wasn't just protecting this little girl. He was trying to fight. Emily turned back to the child. "Stay here," she mouthed, before rising to her feet. She took the stairs one at a time, barely breathing, keeping her steps light. Every instinct in her body told her to run, to grab the girl and Max and get out. But if she did, if she made a sound, whoever was in that house would know exactly where they were. The moment she reached the top, she saw him. A man. Tall, gaunt, his face half hidden in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. He stood in the hallway, a few feet from Max, his eyes locked onto her like a predator sizing up its prey. His clothes were ragged, his skin weathered with dirt and sweat, and in his hand, a crowbar. Emily's heart pounded so hard she swore he could hear it. Mark was still near the doorway, just beyond sight. If she could just call out. But the man moved first. He took a step forward, slow and controlled, his grip on the crowbar tightening. Max lunged, his chain yanking him back mid-leap, his snarl shaking the walls. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. His voice was raspy, like it hadn't been used in days, maybe weeks. Emily swallowed hard. "This house was abandoned," she said carefully, keeping her hands steady, her posture neutral. "Are you the owner?" The man's smile widened, a thin, unsettling curve. He tilted his head slightly. "Does it look like I own this place?" He took another step, and this time Emily did move. She shifted closer to Max, her fingers grazing the rusted chain. If she could just... The man's expression darkened. "You let that dog loose," he said, "and I promise you, you'll regret it." Emily felt her breath catch. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. She had no idea who this man was, but there was no mistaking the way he carried himself. The slow, deliberate way he moved, the eerie stillness in his face. He had been waiting in this house, watching, and he wasn't alone. From the darkness behind him, another figure emerged. A woman. Her hair was wild, tangled, her eyes sunken. She clutched something against her chest, a small, crumpled bag, and when she saw Emily standing there, her breath hitched in a way that sent shivers through the air. "Why did you come?" the woman whispered. Emily's mind reeled, trying to piece it together. The child in the basement, Max, chained as if meant to guard her. The abandoned house that wasn't really abandoned. Something wasn't right. The woman clutched the bag tighter, her fingers white against the fabric. She wasn't supposed to be found. Emily's blood ran cold. The little girl. Max growled louder, his muscles coiling beneath his battered fur. He was ready, waiting for Emily to decide. And she did. With one swift motion, She reached down and unclipped the chain. Max lunged. The man barely had time to react before 80 pounds of muscle and fury slammed into him, knocking him backward. The crowbar clattered to the floor as he hit the ground hard, Max's teeth bared just inches from his throat. Emily didn't wait. She turned and ran, straight past the woman, straight for Mark. "Mark! Run!" Her voice shattered the silence, sending a shockwave of panic through the house. Mark spun just in time to see her, confusion flickering across his face before he caught sight of the woman behind her, and the knife she was holding. He didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he grabbed Emily's arm and yanked her through the doorway, his other hand already reaching for his radio. "Code red. Immediate backup needed. Abandoned house on Sycamore Drive. Armed suspects. Child hostage." The words barely left his lips before something crashed behind them. The woman had lunged, the knife grazing the edge of Emily's jacket, missing her by mere inches. But she didn't chase them. She stopped at the doorway, her chest heaving, her lips parting in something close to a sob. "She was never supposed to be found," she whispered again. Emily didn't stop running. She bolted down the front steps, Mark right behind her, the cold night air slamming into her lungs. And then, a scream. Not from her, not from Mark, from inside. Maximum. Emily spun, her gut wrenching as she saw him, still inside, still snarling at the man who was now scrambling to his feet. The crowbar lay forgotten on the floor, the man's expression twisted in fury, and something else. Desperation. Then, the sound of sirens. Distant, but closing in fast. Emily's heart pounded as she met Max's eyes. He was poised, ready, but something about the way he stood, his ears flicking toward the little girl still hidden in the basement. He wasn't leaving without her, and Emily wasn't leaving without him. Mark grabbed her arm. "Emily, we have to go. Cops are almost here." But Emily already knew what she had to do. She locked eyes with Max, took a deep breath, and ran back inside. Emily moved before logic could catch up with her. Mark's voice rang out behind her, something about waiting for backup, about not being reckless. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let Max face them alone. Not after everything he had already endured. Her boots pounded against the rotting floor as she rushed back into the house. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier, charged with an almost suffocating energy. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the approaching police cars. But there was no safety for Max. Not yet. Inside, the house was chaos. The man had regained his footing, his breath ragged, his face contorted with fury. His crowbar lay forgotten on the floor, but Emily knew better than to assume he was unarmed. People like him didn't need weapons to be dangerous. Max stood his ground between Emily and the man, his stance rigid, his teeth bared in a silent warning. His fur bristled along his back, and his body trembled, not with fear, but with sheer, unwavering determination. Emily's heart clenched. This wasn't just about survival for Max. This was about her, about the little girl in the basement. He wasn't backing down because he had spent days, maybe weeks, guarding something that mattered. And now, he was guarding Emily too. The woman stood frozen near the doorway, her knife still clutched tightly in her shaking hands. But there was something different in her now. Something fractured. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't lunging. She was staring at Max. Tears welled in her eyes, her lips parting like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She started, voice trembling. "I didn't know they'd come." The man turned sharply toward her. "Shut up!" His voice cracked with raw anger. "They weren't supposed to." But his words were cut short by a sound that sent another wave of tension through the air. The girl, a small broken voice from the basement stairs. "Max?" The world seemed to stop. Emily turned just in time to see her. The little girl, barefoot and shivering, standing in the dim light at the edge of the basement. Her wide, haunted eyes darted from Max to the man to Emily, confusion and fear warring on her face. And Max moved. He didn't hesitate. He turned from the man, his entire body shifting with purpose, and in that moment, Emily saw it for what it was. Not hesitation, not distraction, but a choice. Max had been chained, starved, left in this house to rot. He had every reason to lash out, every reason to give in to the pain, to the betrayal, to the neglect. But none of that mattered, because she was here, the little girl, and she needed him. Emily barely had time to react before the man moved too. He lunged, not for Emily, not for the girl, but for Max. His hands shot out, his expression twisted with desperation. Max dodged, but the movement was restricted. The house was too small, the hallway too narrow. The man grabbed at his scruff, yanking him backward with a force that sent them both crashing into the broken remnants of a wooden chair. A yelp tore from Max's throat, sharp and pained. Emily saw red. She launched herself forward, grabbing the first thing she could, an old rusted lamp from the nearby floor. She swung without thinking, without hesitation, the metal base colliding with the man's shoulder with a sickening crack. He howled, staggering backward, releasing his grip on Max. But the damage had been done. Max struggled to stand, his legs wobbling beneath him. His breaths were heavy, strained. The weeks of starvation, the exhaustion, the fight, it was catching up to him. The girl let out a small, strangled sob. Emily knew they had seconds. Sirens screamed from outside now, tires screeching as police vehicles came to a stop in the driveway. Heavy boots pounded against the pavement, voices shouting commands. The man's eyes darted wildly, realization dawning on him. His escape was closing, his body coiled, muscles tightening. He was going to run. Emily wasn't going to let him. She moved without thinking, lunging forward. But she wasn't fast enough. He shoved her aside, sending her sprawling against the floor. Her skull cracked against the wood, stars exploding behind her eyes. By the time she looked up, the man was bolting toward the back of the house, straight for the kitchen, straight for the back door. And then, a blur of movement. Not from Emily, not from the police, but from Max. Emily barely had time to process it. Max, exhausted, weak, hurting, still moved. He forced his battered body forward, his paws barely steady, his ribs pressing against his thin skin with each heavy breath. But he didn't stop. Not until he threw himself in front of the door. The man skidded to a halt. For the first time, true fear flickered in his eyes. Max growled. It was different from before, not just a warning, not just defiance. This was a promise that no matter what happened next, Max wasn't letting him go. The man hesitated. Then, a deafening command from behind them. "Freeze!" The room exploded into chaos. Flashlights flared, voices roared, heavy boots stormed into the house. The man turned, his arms raising just as police swarmed him. He was tackled to the ground within seconds, his shouts drowned out by the sound of handcuffs snapping into place. Emily exhaled sharply, her body sagging with relief. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Max. He was still standing. Barely. His legs trembled. His breath came in uneven, shallow pants. But he was standing. The little girl ran toward him, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. Max let out a soft whimper, leaning into her, his tail thumping once against the floor before he slumped into her arms. Emily was by his side in an instant. She pressed a hand against his ribs, feeling the shallow rise and fall of his breath. He was weak. He needed help. Now. "He needs a vet," she shouted over the noise, her voice breaking. A paramedic rushed forward, nodding. "We'll get him to one, I swear." Emily didn't know when the tears started. She just knew she couldn't stop them. Because as Max lay there, barely able to keep his eyes open, he still did one thing. One last, small thing. He licked the little girl's hand, reassuring her, even now. even after everything. Because that was who he was. That was who he had always been. And no chain, no cruelty, no suffering had been able to take that away from him. Max's body trembled against the little girl's embrace, his breath uneven, shallow. The weight of his suffering pressed against Emily like a stone lodged in her chest. He had fought until the last moment, until his body had given up. But even now, his amber eyes, dulled by exhaustion, still held that same unwavering loyalty. The little girl clutched him tighter, her small fingers tangled in his fur. "Max," she whimpered, her voice shaking. Emily swallowed hard, her hands working quickly to feel for any obvious injuries. He was weak, malnourished, his ribs pressing sharply against her palms with every labored breath. He needed warmth. He needed medical care. He needed out of this house. "Stay with me, buddy," she whispered. The officers had secured the man and woman, their shouts blending into the background. Mark was at her side now, his face pale, his breathing heavy from the adrenaline dump. "The paramedics are setting up outside," he said quickly. "We need to get him out of here now." Emily nodded, forcing herself into motion. The little girl hesitated as Emily gently pried her fingers from Max's fur. She didn't want to let go. Emily met her wide, terrified eyes. "He's going to be okay," she promised, even though she didn't know if it was true. She bent down, slipping her arms carefully beneath Max's frail body. He let out a soft, pained whimper as she lifted him, his weight far lighter than it should have been. It made her stomach twist. How long had he been left like this? How long had he suffered, waiting for someone to come? Max let his head rest against Emily's shoulder as she carried him out of the house, stepping into the flashing red and blue chaos of the night. The cold air bit at her skin, but Max barely reacted. He was slipping. "Hang on, buddy," she murmured, tightening her grip. The paramedics were already waiting with a stretcher. As Emily laid Max down, his body limp beneath her hands, she felt something sharp wedge itself into her throat. Fear. The kind she hadn't felt in a long time. "His pulse is weak," one of the paramedics said, checking over Max's frail form. "We need to move." "I'm coming with him," Emily said immediately, her voice leaving no room for argument. One of the officers nodded, waving her toward the ambulance. "Go. We'll handle everything here." Emily climbed in, barely noticing Mark giving her a reassuring nod before the doors shut behind her. Then they were moving. The ambulance rumbled beneath her as she sat beside Max, her fingers brushing against his fur. His eyes fluttered open for the briefest second, looking up at her. "You did good, boy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You did so good." His tail gave the faintest thump against the stretcher. And then his eyes closed again. Emily didn't let go of him the whole way to the emergency vet. But the next few hours blurred into a haze of waiting rooms and rapid medical discussions. The veterinary team worked with urgency, stabilizing Max, running fluids through his frail body, checking for deeper wounds that weren't immediately visible. Emily paced the floor outside the operating room, her hands shaking, her chest tight. Mark arrived not long after, the little girl bundled in a warm blanket, a social worker by her side. Emily rushed to them the moment she saw them. "How is she?" The girl didn't answer, only staring at her with those wide, solemn eyes. "She's in shock," the social worker said gently. "But she's safe now." Emily crouched in front of her, searching for words, something to ground the child in the whirlwind of everything that had just happened. "You were really brave," she said softly. "Max protected you, didn't he?" For the first time, the girl moved. She nodded. "Max always stayed with me," she whispered. Emily reached out, gently squeezing her tiny hand. "And I promise, we're going to make sure he's okay. He's a fighter." The little girl blinked up at her, searching her face, as if weighing whether or not to believe her. Finally, she nodded again. Emily exhaled, But before she could say more, a door opened down the hall. The vet stepped out. Her face was unreadable. Emily's stomach dropped. "Is he?" The vet held up a hand, cutting off the question before Emily could force it out. "He made it through the worst of it," she said carefully. "But he's not out of the woods yet." Emily's knees nearly buckled with relief. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished. There were signs of old injuries, nothing fresh, but enough to tell us he's been through a lot. The vet sighed, shaking her head. "Honestly, I don't know how he held on as long as he did." Emily did. Because Max wasn't just any dog. He had been fighting for her, for the little girl, for something bigger than himself. The vet hesitated, then gave Emily a small, knowing look. "He's going to need time, care, a lot of patience." Emily already knew what she was about to ask. "Does he have an owner?" The vet's lips pressed together. "There's no microchip, and given the circumstances, I highly doubt he belongs to anyone who deserves him." Emily's heart pounded. "Then I want him," she said before she could even think. The words came fast, absolute, unshakable. Mark let out a small breath of laughter behind her. "You sure?" Emily turned, shooting him a look. "Of course I'm sure." The vet smiled. "We'll start the paperwork." Emily turned back toward the little girl. She was watching her closely, eyes darting between Emily and the door where Max was being treated. "Can I see him?" she asked quietly. Emily crouched down beside her again. "Not yet, sweetheart," she said. "But soon." The girl hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached for Emily's hand and squeezed. Emily squeezed back. Max had spent so long chained, waiting for something, someone. And now, he had a home and a family, forever. The sun had just begun to rise when Emily finally stepped into the recovery room. The faint glow of morning filtered through the blinds, casting soft streaks of light over Max's still form. He lay curled on a thick, warm blanket, his ribs still painfully visible beneath his coat, but his breathing had steadied. His chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic motion, proof that he had made it through the night. Emily exhaled, tension finally easing from her body. She stepped closer, kneeling beside him. His fur was clean now, the grime and dried blood washed away, revealing the true colors of his coat. A deep black saddle over a warm tan. His paws twitched slightly in sleep, as if he were running in some distant dream. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, reaching out to gently stroke the fur along his neck. Max's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, and then, slowly, his amber eyes fluttered open. He blinked groggily, as if trying to place where he was, and for a moment, fear flickered in his expression. Emily's heart clenched. He was so used to waking up in pain, in hunger, in chains. But not today. "You're safe," she said softly. "No more chains. No more waiting." Max's gaze locked onto hers, searching, as if trying to make sense of her words. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he let his head rest against her hand. He believed her. Emily smiled, blinking back the tears that burned behind her eyes. The door creaked open behind her, and she turned to see the little girl standing in the doorway, still wrapped in the oversized hospital blanket. She hesitated for only a moment before taking a cautious step inside. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice small, fragile. Emily nodded, shifting aside so the girl could come closer. "He's tired, but he's going to be okay." The girl knelt beside Max, her tiny fingers reaching out hesitantly. When she touched his fur, Max let out a soft sigh and nuzzled closer, his tail twitching just slightly. The girl's face broke into the smallest, most hopeful smile Emily had ever seen. "He always protected me," she whispered, almost to herself. "Even when he was hurt." Emily swallowed past the lump in her throat. "And now it's our turn to protect him." The girl glanced up at her then, studying her with those wide, knowing eyes. "You love him too," she said simply. Emily let out a soft laugh, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Yeah," she admitted. "Yeah, I do." The little girl considered this, then nodded, as if accepting some unspoken agreement between them. They would protect him. Together. And the days that followed were slow, filled with healing. Max regained his strength little by little, his body finally learning what it meant to rest without fear. The little girl, whose name Emily learned was Sophie, stayed in protective custody while the authorities sorted through the nightmare of her past. But she and Max were never apart for long. She would sit beside him for hours, reading to him from the books the social worker brought. Max, despite his exhaustion, would always lift his head when he heard her voice, his tail wagging weakly. Emily watched them, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest. She had spent years rescuing animals, had seen so many cases of neglect and abuse. But this was different. Because Max hadn't just survived for himself. He had survived for her. And now, Sophie was doing the same for him. 1 week later, Emily signed the final adoption papers. Max was hers. The moment the vet handed over the paperwork, she pressed the folder against her chest, inhaling deeply. "You're really doing this, huh?" Mark teased, leaning against the doorframe. Emily shot him a look. "Like there was ever a chance I wouldn't?" He grinned. "I didn't doubt you for a second." Emily turned back toward the glass window that looked into the recovery room. Max was standing on shaky legs now, his fur healthier, his posture stronger. He was still thin, still recovering, but when he met her eyes through the glass, his ears perked up and his tail wagged. He knew. She belonged to him just as much as he belonged to her. Sophie sat beside him, flipping through the pages of a picture book. She paused when she saw Emily, tilting her head. "Does this mean he's coming home?" she asked, hope flickering in her voice. Emily smiled. "Yeah," she said, "he's coming home." That night, Max stepped into Emily's house for the first time. He hesitated at the doorway, his paws pressing into the welcome mat as he sniffed the air. Emily crouched beside him, letting him take his time. "You don't have to be afraid," she said gently. "This is your home now." Max let out a soft breath, as if taking in the words. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Sophie was already inside, setting up a soft bed of blankets in the living room. She patted the space beside her excitedly. "Come on, Max!" Max's ears flicked toward her, his tail swaying slightly. Then, with a quiet huff, he walked over and curled up beside her. Sophie giggled, resting her head against his side. "Told you," she murmured. "We're safe now." Emily leaned against the doorway, watching them settle into this new reality. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. No more chains. No more waiting. Max was home. And so were they. Over the next few weeks, Max's transformation was nothing short of incredible. His ribs, once painfully prominent, slowly disappeared beneath a thick, healthy coat. His eyes, once dulled with exhaustion, now gleamed with life. Emily took him on long walks, watching as he sniffed every blade of grass, every fallen leaf, as if experiencing the world for the first time. And maybe he was. He had spent so long locked away, suffering, surviving. Now, he was living. And Sophie had begun to heal too. She laughed more, spoke more. The nightmares that had once kept her awake at night grew less frequent, replaced by whispered bedtime stories and the steady, comforting presence of Max curled at the foot of her bed. They were healing together. And Emily? For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. One evening, as the sun set in golden hues over the horizon, Emily sat on the porch, Max resting his head on her lap while Sophie doodled in a notebook beside them. Mark pulled up in his truck, stepping out with a knowing grin. "So," he said, leaning against the railing, "I guess you got yourself a real family now." Emily glanced down at Max, at Sophie, at the quiet peace that had settled into her once empty home. "Yeah," she said, smiling. "I guess I do." Mark nodded, tipping his hat before heading inside to grab a drink. Emily turned back toward the sky, her fingers running through Max's fur. He let out a content sigh, his tail thumping against the wooden porch. For so long, Max had waited. For someone to save him. For someone to love him. And now, he didn't have to wait anymore. Because he was home. Forever. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Max was no longer the frail, trembling dog that had been chained inside that abandoned house. He had gained weight, his coat now sleek and full. His once weary eyes now shone with joy, especially when he ran alongside Sophie in the backyard, his tail wagging wildly, as if to make up for all the time he had lost. Sophie, too, was healing. The quiet, scared little girl who had once clung to Max in fear was now bursting with laughter, her voice carrying through the house like music. She had found safety, stability, and, most importantly, love. Emily watched them from the porch, sipping her coffee as the golden light of the evening bathed the yard in warmth. She never thought her life would change like this. She had rescued countless animals before, but Max had been different. Max hadn't just needed saving, he had saved them too.